What happened to Sheila Josephine Harris, and why this case angered the public? Sheila Josephine Harris was a young woman who won a beauty contest and was discovered dead in her own apartment. The police started looking for the murderer without realizing the repercussions it would have. Sheila Josephine Harris was born on February 26, 1963, in Douglas County, Nevada. She knew she wanted to be an actress or a model from a young age. Therefore, she actively competed in numerous beauty contests during her school years. Sheila won a local beauty contest in her district in her senior year of high school and planned to compete for Miss Nevada and Miss Carson City in case of victory. Despite such ambitious plans, the young woman decided to pursue a higher education in the field of business and trade after graduating. They later remarried and had 2 more daughters, and Sheila actively assisted her mother in caring for her younger sisters. They tried to see each other as often as possible, but due to her studies and work, they were only able to spend time together a few times a week. On January 4, 1939, the young woman rented an apartment and took a part-time job at a supermarket to cover her living expenses. The young woman took her studies and work very seriously because she wanted to have a good education and provide for herself independently. Sheila was scheduled to start her morning shift at the supermarket the following day, so she wanted to go to bed early despite his injury. Stephen decided to see her off, and they parted at the entrance to the residential complex the following day. Sheila did not show up for work. The store manager noticed her absence and was greatly alarmed. Stephen had recently broken his arm, and the young woman occasionally visited him. He once called Sheila's home phone, but there was no answer, so we got in touch with her mother to find out if anything had happened. At first, Sheila's mother assumed that Sheila had simply overslept, but when the building manager said he had called Sheila's home phone, the woman became alarmed. She decided to visit Sheila's apartment, but she asked a friend to go with her because she was too worried and afraid to go alone. The mother arrived at. She entered the apartment and was greeted by a horrifying scene that caused her to scream. Sheila lay in bed without any signs of life. Blood was all around her, and bruises could be seen all over her neck. Although a friend had tried to prevent the mother from seeing this heartbreaking scene, the woman still went inside and saw her dead daughter. When the police arrived, they started to investigate the crime scene and discovered that the young woman had been strangled and had suffered severe injuries. Medical examiners determined that the young woman had been tied up and subjected to violence. The perpetrator had dealt her several blows, probably with a board or other heavy piece of wood, and then strangled her with an electric cable, which caused her death. Investigators were unable to find the board or the cable in the apartment, but they did find wood chips underneath Sheila's clothing and body. In 1982, professionals were able to remove biological evidence from the murderer, who may have been the murder weapon, but they could now perform a DNA test. The brutality with which the attacker treated his victim initially led the detectives to believe that this crime could have been committed haphazardly and that the perpetrator might be mentally unstable. However, it soon became evident that this attack was meticulously planned. First, there were no signs of forced entry on the door, which means that the attack was carried out without using force. Investigators believe that the perpetrator was not a first-time offender and may have been a serial killer or someone who had previously committed a similar crime, because Sheila must have allowed the perpetrator in on her own. No one else in the apartment building heard anything, and the killer took a wire and a wooden board, depriving the police of 2 crucial pieces of evidence. Sheila chose the apartment because the rent was low and she could not afford to live in a more prestigious neighborhood on her salary from the supermarket. This only complicated the police's work since many people in the neighborhood knew Sheila. With almost no evidence, investigators started looking for witnesses. They interviewed all the building's residents, but none of them noticed anything suspicious that night. The first day, the police had the most obvious suspect. Sheila's boyfriend Stephen's statistics show that it is often people close to the victim who commit such crimes, and Stephen might have been the last person to see Sheila before the murder. He said he accosted her a month after the murder. Investigators carefully studied local residents and tried to identify who might be involved. They questioned about 70 men, but they were unable to establish their involvement. When local media learned that the detectives were considering Stephen as a suspect, they quickly learned that his family had strong ties to the police. His brother was the sheriff of Carson City, and his father previously held the same position before retiring, so as a result, Newspapers started to smear the young man's name. The young man also had no alibi for the rest of that day and was unable to prove that he did not enter Sheila's apartment. Residents of Carson City demanded that the teenager be immediately arrested, and some even called for the death penalty. The situation was further complicated by the Carson City residents' conviction that Stephen was responsible for the crime and that his brother and father were using their position and connections to conceal it. This led to people protesting, writing angry letters to Stephen and his family, and even threatening violence. Investigators tried to determine if the boy had a motive for committing such a crime after speaking with Sheila's friends and learning that the couple had never experienced any significant issues and that the young woman had never complained of aggression from Stephen. In addition, the victims had serious injuries that required the killer to exert significant effort, and Stephen had a broken arm at the time. He was also arrested for being drunk in public. The detectives started to believe the boy was innocent as a result of this, but it was too late. Under pressure from the public's threats and constant accusations, Stephen committed suicide before he could be completely cleared of suspicion. As a result, the police had only one candidate for the murderer's role: David Winfield Mitchell, a gardener and handyman who was assigned to the apartment building where Sheila lived. However, there was no direct evidence pointing to Mitchell as the murderer. When suspicions against Mitchell started to grow, detectives re-interviewed residents of the complex and other employees to see if anyone had noticed any strange or suspicious behavior from the gardener, and in doing so, they learned that the man could enter any apartment in the complex to perform some repair work, and that shortly after the murder, he resigned and left in an unknown direction. The police tried to find him, but he seemed to have disappeared. When attractive young women passed by, he kept his eyes off them and watched them silently until they disappeared from view. Several tenants thought this was odd, and investigators began to suspect that he was the person who killed Sheila. A man was declared wanted, but over the following years they were unable to find him. Meanwhile, forensic scientists had one more trick up their sleeves. They discovered a hair in the victim's apartment that may have belonged to Mitchie. Tobago and experts were able to determine that the hair found matched his ethnicity. DNA analysis wasn't yet available in those days, so they couldn't determine a 100% match with Mitchell's DNA. In 1986, 4 years after the murder, the police finally received a lead on the man's whereabouts. He was living outside the state and was soon arrested. During questioning, Mitchell denied his guilt, and the detective said only one thing: a hair that presumably belonged to him. Investigators continued to suspect Mitchell of killing the young woman, but they lacked solid evidence and realized the case had no chance of success in court. As a result, they decided to free Mitchell because no judge would have found him guilty based solely on one hair, which could have in fact been left there during cleaning. Since that time, there have been no developments in this case. Sheila's mother learned about how new DNA analysis technologies could help solve such crimes and contacted the detective in charge of the case. The woman persuaded him to send the killer's biological material to the laboratory and request a comparison with Mitchell's. Since they couldn't prove the man's guilt, they practically put the investigation on hold until 1999, 13 years after the murder. After the 1986 interrogation, after a protracted wait, the investigators received the long-awaited results. The semen sample from the victim's body completely matched David Mitchell's DNA. Experts also concluded that the voice heard in the victim's apartment belonged to him. As a result, the police had 100% proof of Mitchell's guilt. However, Mitchell had returned to his native country and obtained employment as a security guard in a government institution. This presented a new challenge for the investigators. In order to extradite Mitchell, which was difficult, they had to go through all the bureaucratic red tape and demonstrate to the government of Trinidad and Tobago that Mitchell was the one who committed the murder. This process took several years, and federal authorities and the state government engaged in talks with the other state for the following 7 years, until 2006, when a decision was finally made to extradite him. The suspect was brought to Carson City, and soon one of the most high-profile murder cases in recent memory took place there. Second, journalists focused heavily on the fact that the victim's friend Stephen had committed suicide due to accusations against him. The court had to decide whether David was the real killer or whether the entire town mistakenly believed Stephen was guilty. Mitchell's attorney used these societal uncertainties in his strategy and insisted that David was not the real killer. They had another indirect argument on the day of the murder. Stephen had a cast on his hand. First, the young man was unlikely to have been able to inflict all these injuries on the victim with one hand. Second, particles of the cast would undoubtedly have been found at the crime scene, but there were none. The prosecution side refuted these arguments by citing compelling evidence that DNA testing in modern conditions has extremely low chances of error. In the late 1960s, when the suspect was living in New York, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting 3 young women in their homes. Mitchell broke into their home, tied the women up with an electric cable, and subjected them to violence. After his release from prison, he moved. On the prosecution side, during the trial, they revealed information that had not been made publicly available before. In spite of his prior sentence, Mitchell received only 3 years in prison, of which he served 1.5 years, and was released on parole. He was then supposed to be deported to his native country. However, the man vanished from the police, moved to Carson City, and got a job as a gardener in that same complex, all the while avoiding capture. The young women managed to fight him off. They called the police, and 9 months later Mitchell was arrested. The investigation after Sheila's murder also raised concerns because the investigators had no knowledge of Mitchell's criminal history, contrary to the prosecution's version on the night of Sheila's murder. David knocked on her door and said that he had something he needed to do. If the system had not allowed him to leave so early, the young woman would likely still be alive. The same is true for the management of the residential complex, who, without knowing it, hired a serial rapist who fled from the police, which he used to stun the victim, and Mitchell committed all these crimes alongside her before fleeing the scene with the board and the electric cable. Because the jury reached a unanimous verdict in less than 30 minutes, David was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, but his attorney argued for leniency by pointing out that Mitchell had been reformed and had lived an honest life for 25 years after the murder. David was 63 years old when we started his prison term. He spent most of his life on the run, and now he only has to spend the rest of his days in prison. Sheila's mother thanked the court for not allowing this monster to walk free. She claimed that if he hadn't been released early in the 1980s, her daughter would still be alive today. However, one question still remained that perplexed investigators. How did he get away with it? The offender was obviously serial, so it is likely that he may have attacked other women. He evaded capture for 25 years, so it is likely that his acts may have caused harm to other people. However, it is unclear whether the police will be able to find the truth. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching. The police started looking for a girl who had spent the night at her friend's house before she vanished without a trace the next morning. Her bedroom window was wide open and all of her belongings were still there. No one suspected the dark secrets that would soon come to light in the small town. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Amanda Lenka was born on June 7, 1991 in Tennessee. She grew up in a big, loving family with many brothers and sisters before moving with their parents to Spring Hill, Florida. She loved spending time there because she had many friends there. White Cloud was a quiet, peaceful town with a population of only 400 people. Most of its residents knew each other. Children played without adult supervision, and no one worried about their safety. Amanda was passionate about dancing, writing poetry, playing multiple musical instruments, and being a very positive child. During school breaks, she always went to her grandparents' house in that town. On June 20th, Amanda spent the night at the home of her best friend. They chatted, had fun, and went to bed late. The next morning, her friend woke up and discovered Amanda was not in the room. The bedroom windows were wide open. She went to the kitchen and looked all over the house, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. Amanda had just completed the 7th grade of middle school. She spent the entire summer in White Cloud with her friends, went for walks, and enjoyed her vacation. Belongings, such as clothes and a backpack, were left in the bedroom. When the friend reported Amanda missing to her parents, they called her grandparents, walked several blocks, and called the parents of Amanda's other friends, but no one had seen her. Then the relatives decided to contact the police because they realized that Amanda could not have left without notice, especially in just her pajamas. First, investigators spoke with the friend of Amanda, who claimed that she did not see Amanda L., the girl's friend's parents, as well as her brother and sister, were in the house at the time of the disappearance, but none of them heard or saw anything. Police also tried to find witnesses who lived nearby that night, but they came up empty-handed. On the first day of the investigation, the investigators came to the conclusion that the girl had likely left home on her own initiative and run away. This version outraged Amanda's relatives, who insisted that the girl had no problems at home and was happy to spend the entire summer in White Cloud. In addition, they pointed out that the girl left all her things, including clothes, in her friend's room, and that 5 people did not hear anything. It was difficult to imagine a scenario in which Amanda could have been abducted without waking up her friend who was sleeping just a meter away. When word of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout the neighborhood, the police received numerous calls from witnesses who claimed to have seen a similar girl in various locations, which only increased the detectives' certainty that Amanda had fled her home. Unable to confirm any of these leads, the investigators decided to check the girl's computer in the hopes of finding some information that could aid in the search. They discovered pertinent information. Although there were inconsistencies, these correspondences made no mention of a potential meeting and were about routine, everyday matters. The investigators still believed they had enough evidence to confirm their suspicions at the time. However, word of Amanda's correspondence with a particular man quickly spread among the city's residents, leading many to believe that she had run away to meet him. Because of this misunderstanding, the investigators did not really use the full scope of their resources. If they had officially classified this case as a kidnapping, they could have enlisted the FBI and other agencies in the investigation. Instead, they chose to focus on the case themselves. Meanwhile, Amanda's family was posting flyers and giving interviews to various media outlets, insisting that Amanda could not have fled on her own initiative. On July 5th, mushroom pickers went to a forest about 10 kilometers from White Cloud, where they discovered a human body and reported it to the police. Investigators arrived at the scene and immediately recognized the body as Amanda because she was lanky and wearing the same pajamas she had disappeared in. Despite their half-hearted search for her, they never found any serious leads on her possible location, and the investigation dragged on for several weeks. Confirmed her identity and discovered that Amanda had died the night of her disappearance after suffering multiple blows from a heavy object. Investigators came to the conclusion that the victim had been killed elsewhere before being brought to the forest, but they were unable to find any significant leads, so they decided to speak to everyone who knew the girl. Over the course of the following few days, police interviewed about 400 people, or nearly 1/3 of the population of White Cloud. However, since the young man with whom Amanda had communicated online had the word killer in his nickname, they decided to take another look at him. While this did not produce any answers, the police also decided to consider the possibility that the victim actually went to meet him and was killed there. However, this theory still had many flaws. For instance, there was no evidence to support the idea that the girl would have gone to meet someone in the middle of the night while wearing pajamas, and there was also no evidence that in an effort to find some new leads, detectives decided to examine all of Amanda's possessions, which resulted in a breakthrough. They discovered her personal diary, which contained very disturbing information. Shortly before her death, Amanda wrote that a certain man had been harassing her, and the next several pages were torn out. The investigator could not identify this person, and soon the version of his involvement was no longer taken into consideration. Leaving the case, police attempted to identify the man's identity. They spoke to all of Amanda's friends and asked if the girl had brought up anything regarding this. Several of her friends acknowledged that she had indeed told them about it, and even named the man Cecil Wallace. He was the stepfather of Amanda's friend with whom she had spent the night for detectives. This information was a real surprise. They had been searching for the killer throughout the town and beyond, and in the end, but the testimony of the friends was not enough to arrest him. Investigators had no substantial evidence against the man. No DNA samples were found on the victim's body, and the court documents did not indicate whether she had been subjected to violence. Detectives questioned Wallace, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The police themselves wondered how the man could have done all this unnoticed, In a small house where his wife and 3 children slept without serious evidence or confession, they could not detain Wallace, therefore. The detectives continued to work on all possible leads soon after an interesting fact emerged. It turned out that Wallace's sister Candace worked in the police department that was handling Amanda's case. Moreover, the woman actively helped her brother and his family during the interrogations. She literally told him what to say and how to behave. But that was not all. 5 years ago, she was fired from another police department for falsifying a report on her brother's accident. She wrote that he was driving on a road. Wallace claimed that a deer ran out in front of him as he was driving. But in reality, the man was drunk and had an accident. At that point, other detectives were already working on Amanda's case, and they questioned the impartiality of the local police's investigation, but they were unable to confirm that anyone else could be assisting Wallace. The investigators spoke with Wallace and his family several more times, but this did not produce any results. They continued to search for any leads, but instead of finding any 4 years after the murder in 2008, detectives turned to the National Center for Missing and Explosion after receiving repeated complaints from the Wallace family that their home had been vandalized. The town's unanimity that the man was a murderer and that his sister was covering it up only increased in negative sentiments. Wallace continued to live among them freely, which only heightened these feelings. 3 more years passed before the police finally got a new lead that changed everything. In 2011, a 27-year-old Texas woman who grew up in White Cloud went to a news website from her old town where she found information about Amanda's murder and swore it was her. She then contacted the police. They had gone through all the case materials, conducted new interrogations, and tried to find new leads. Ultimately, they came to the same conclusion as the local detectives, that there was not enough evidence to make an in 1998, when the victim was 13 years old and still a resident of that city. She spent the night at the Wallace home because she was friends with his second foster daughter. In the middle of the night, a man broke into their room and assaulted both of them before threatening to keep quiet. The victims were too terrified to call the police, so they never reported what had happened. In Amanda's case, she made the decision to contact the police, and then she provided them with a statement that assisted investigators in moving closer to the arrest of the suspect. They spoke with many people in White Cloud who might have been impacted by Wallace's actions, and this tactic was successful because they were able to identify several women who admitted that the man had touched them inappropriately. This incident occurred between 1998 and 2002. The victims were then between the ages of 13 and 16. Putting all this information together, police detained Wallace, 43, in October 2011. Wallace was charged with sexually assaulting these victims and was also the first person to be officially named as a suspect in Amanda's case. Detectives had no doubt that Wallace was responsible for the murder, and at the preliminary hearing, he was given bail of $150,000, and other family members assisted him in raising the funds. The trial was scheduled to start in a month. While waiting for this, Wallace returned to work. The locals were not happy that he had been released on bail. They frequently protested outside the company's office, demanding that this man be fired. On November 10th, on the day of the first court hearing, an unexpected turn occurred. Wallace did not show up at the appointed time, and the police immediately declared him wanted. A few days later, Wallace was found in a local jail. Detectives who did not anticipate this turn of events were forced to continue the inquiry after the suspect passed away. They could only rely on strong evidence that could connect him to Amanda's death. They obtained a search warrant for his home in an effort to find any evidence connected to Amanda's murder. They looked around every corner, tore down some walls and lifted floorboards, but they found nothing. After gathering the necessary evidence, detectives turned their attention to the suspect's sister, Candace, believing that she was protecting her brother and wanting to know if she was aware that he had killed Amanda. Candace was detained in August 2012. She was accused of deliberately misleading the investigation, but that was just the beginning. Throughout the course of the investigation, detectives discovered that Candace had been concealing her brother's drug dealing during those times. Candace also advised him to always carry a cigarette with someone else's DNA on it, so that if necessary he could plant it at the crime scene. Detectives also concluded that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. All of them were members of his family. The police were also of the opinion that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. Wallace's sister could not provide consulting services on a case that she was working on as a police officer, given that she had been assisting her brother through interrogations. She broke this rule and was ultimately punished, but Candace insisted that her brothel was involved for another 2 years before making a deal with the police in which she admitted to lying to the investigators in exchange for the dismissal of 2 other charges. If a person has committed a minor offense, they can be given several weekends in jail. This way they receive a punishment, but it does not significantly affect their life. The convicted person can continue to go to work and spend time with their family, of course. This is a dubious practice where the convict is only required to be in the jail building for 2 days a week and can freely roam during the rest of the time. In 2004, medical experts only handed over part of Amanda's remains to her family so they could hold a funeral. The remainder was to be kept by detectives during the investigation, but after Wallace's death, a decision was made to hand over the remainder to the family. The detectives were sure that Candace had helped her brother avoid punishment, and because approving it 100% was not possible, she received such a light punishment. Amanda's family was forced to undergo yet another trial. She also works to change the law to change how the police search for missing children. The mother insists that investigators should not conduct an investigation based on their subjective assessments and consider the disappearance as a voluntary escape from home. Thus, there is almost no doubt that Wallace committed the disappearance. However, there is still some doubt that Wallace committed the disappearance. Given that there is no information in the court records regarding whether the victim was subjected to violence, 2 assumptions can be made. He likely assaulted her but did not leave his biological material, so the investigation decided not to disclose this fact because it was unnecessary. Detectives could also withhold this information for the sake of the investigation in the hopes that the criminal would reveal facts that had never been revealed. His prior crimes also speak in FA. The detective suggested that all of Wallace's relatives who were in the house on the night of the murder were aware of the crime and may have even assisted in it. Wallace had at least 3 victims using the same scheme, and all of them stayed at his house overnight. The question is why he killed Amanda. Perhaps he intended to intimidate her like the others, but the girl threatened to tell the truth to everyone or she tried to flee from him and he panicked. The fact that Wallace settled the score with his life before the trial speaks in favor of his guilt, even though he took the specifics of this crime to the grave, as his wife, son, and daughter were present, which may have explained how he was able to attack the victim without waking any of his family. In any case, even without a final ruling from the court, Wallace will no longer be able to harm anyone. Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching. In June 2000, 15-year-old Leah Freeman vanished, leaving a small town in shock. With rumors swirling and a distraught boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, desperately searching, the police investigation took unexpected twists. Witness testimonies, concealed evidence, and advanced DNA testing would lead to revelations and suspicions. Dive into the mysteries and uncover the truth behind Leah Freeman's disappearance in this video. At 10:15 p.m. on June 28, 2000, the Courtwright home received a call. The phone was answered by Corey Courtwright. Nick McGuffin, Leah's 18-year-old boyfriend, was the one who inquired as to her whereabouts. Nick had picked up Leah from their house about 4 p.m., which caught Corey off guard. Little did she realize the difficulties she would face in the future. Nick McGuffin, who was 3 years older than Leah Freeman, went to the same school as her. The 2 young people finally began dating after becoming acquaintances at some time. This alarmed Leah's mother, Corey, who had learned that her daughter and Nick shared more than just a spiritual bond. They also had a physical one. Around 4 p.m. on that day, Nick drove up in his vintage Mustang to pick up Leah. Leah bid her mom bye before leaving in the car. The young pair enjoyed listening to loud music while driving. Nick claims that he dropped Leah off at the home of her closest friend Sherry at around 7 o'clock. They agreed that he would pick her up from there at 9 o'clock. But when he arrived there, Leah was gone, and the guy Leah was staying with told him that they had gotten into a fight, which caused Leah to get furious and leave. Leah was nowhere to be found when Nick started driving around the streets looking for her. Nick encouraged Corey not to worry and reassured her that he would locate Leah and bring her home at around 7 a.m. as their chat came to an end. On June 29th, still waiting for her daughter to come home, Corey called Nick's house to inquire about her whereabouts. Shortly after they reported her missing to the police at the station, Nick was shocked because he thought she was at home. Leah climbed into the car with Nick, and Corey recalled the moment she last saw her daughter. He claimed that after speaking with Leah's mother on the phone, he kept driving around the city looking for the teenager, substantiating his allegation that Nick had been stopped by the police twice the day before, owing to he was pulled over by the police on several occasions, all of which he stated he was looking for Leah. He asked his buddy Kristen Steinhoff for assistance after being stopped for the second time owing to a problem with the car. They then drove around the city for nearly an hour in her car, but it did not work, and they went their separate ways. According to Nick, he then made the decision to walk close to Leah's house once more. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a light inside of her. He went back to his own house with peace of mind, assuming she was already there. Starting with his friend whom he had left Leah with the night before, the cops started looking into what Nick had disclosed. Sherry corroborated Nick's account by stating that Leah had visited her home yesterday, but fled following their disagreement. Sherry explained that Leah wanted to go for a run, but her mother wouldn't let her since Leah often gets in trouble for asking to go for a run. Nick picks her up, sending her home alone. Leah heard her friend and her mother having this chat, became offended, and left Sherry's home right away. Sherry claimed that she attempted to stop Leah, but that she was enraged and continued to leave. And while Leah was at Sherry's, Nick spent time with his friends at a nearby lake, according to his friends. Later, the authorities produced evidence indicating the young people had met there with a purpose, and Nick's involvement was a key factor in their plan. Leah loathed him and their disagreement very much. Kristen, a friend of Nick's, also corroborated his claim that they were looking for Leah in her car. There have never been any high-profile crimes in Kokyo, a little town with a population of just under 4,000. The disappearance of Leah Freeman raised a lot of controversy in the neighborhood. When Leah left her friend's home, the police looked for any witnesses who may have seen her. It was discovered that she was last observed alone in a downtown area close to her school. It's possible that she was on her way home, but it has now been discovered that she never arrived. Leah's mother disputed the police's assertion that her daughter had simply run away from home, saying her daughter had no justification for doing so. Nick's home and car were the subject of search warrants issued by the police. The only noteworthy discovery of the car search was the missing lining in the trunk. Otherwise, it was absolutely empty and devoid of any tools or a spare tire. The detectives found nothing of significance in the house. His father, Nick, began to understand that he had changed from my witness to the only suspect during the interrogation, when it was stated that everything had been taken out because of a fuel leak. Nick attempted to disregard the accusations that he was somehow connected to Leah's abduction as he kept looking for his loved one by distributing flyers bearing her picture. 3 days after Leah Freeman vanished, something happened that caused the police's perception to shift away from the idea that the young woman might have been abducted. The woman had fled. Near the school where Leah was last seen, a man who worked at a nearby vehicle service business approached the police. He recalled that on the night of the young woman's disappearance, he had been working late and was about to leave when he saw a shoe by the roadside that looked like one of his kids' sneakers, which they occasionally brought to his business. He took it home after picking it up. The father didn't recall anything until Leah's disappearance caused a stir. He turned it over to the police after assuring them it wasn't his children's. The footwear belonged to Leah, according to the young woman's family, who confirmed this. It was discovered on Northern Elm Street close to the local school and cemetery. Her right foot belongs in the sneaker. It was Leah Freeman's shoes, according to the results of the forensic investigation. A week later, something was found that clearly suggested the missing young woman had suffered a terrible fate. In the second sneaker Leah owned, it was in the Hudson Ridge area, about 7.5 miles from where the first sneaker was discovered, on an old logging road, a remote location where one might easily conceal themselves from prying eyes. A forensic examination of the sneaker revealed dry stains of a dark red hue that contained Leah Freeman's biological material. Leah's mother claims that the police didn't start treating her daughter's absence seriously, or stop thinking her a runaway until the sneaker was found. Were organized by the police to search the area after a second shoe was discovered. On August 3, 2000, 5 weeks after Leah Freeman vanished, one of the search teams detected a strong stench and found her body. Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, had been holding on to the hope that her daughter would finally return home. In the vicinity of Lee Valley Road, it had been hurled over the brink of a narrow brook. The area was very forested, and there was no one there. If not for the potent stink, the body might have remained unnoticed for a lot longer. The murderer had picked a decent location nearby to conceal the body. The prolonged exposure of the body to the high temperature caused extensive decomposition, making it impossible for investigators to collect any usable evidence. Another factor was the local police's inexperience with such investigations. The map reveals the following. Leah was last seen close to the school, not far from where her right shoe was discovered. The body was recovered 2.5 miles from the place where the left sneaker was found, which was located 5 miles from the right one. The cops were further perplexed by the body's detachment from the shoes. As a result, after the body was discovered, the inquiry stalled rather than making the anticipated progress. The police were reticent to divulge anything, and it was clear from the lack of any arrests or charges that they had no solid leads. Meanwhile, rumors started to circulate despite the fact that the young man appeared to be grieving over his loved one's passing. Most people in the small village of Coquille think that Leah's boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, was involved in everything and was concealing something. The majority of people accused him. As they had no other suspects, the police again called him in for interrogation. Despite their pressure, however, there were no breakthroughs in the investigation. It became clear that the investigation had reached a standstill a year later. Police did not have any fresh suspects. Nick. After another 6 years passed, the small town that was shaken by the high-profile crime slowly returned to normal. In 2007, Nick's daughter was born, and society started to accept him again. However, for Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, life seemed to have stopped the day she lost her daughter. She never stopped reminding the local police chief about the unsolved case 8 years later. The detectives were unpleasantly surprised to find that the evidence gathered in 2000 was dispersed, and some of it was completely useless. Witness testimonies from that time were reviewed, and dozens of people were interviewed once more, including Kristen Steinhoff, Nick's friend. Mark Daniels took over the Coquille police, and he gave the case a fresh perspective by assembling a team of specialists from across the state. Her remarks on the night of her disappearance were different from what she had claimed 8 years prior. She recalled how Nick visited her home that evening about midnight, and the two of them had a cigarette. Nick then began kissing her, but it didn't last long since she objected. Nick McGuffin was called in for additional questioning after her testimony rekindled earlier suspicions about him. Kristen's testimony was corroborated, and he acknowledged that what she had stated was accurate, but he had been reluctant to do so in 2000 when the police had publicly suggested that Leah might have the most surprising development was the appearance of a witness years later who claimed to have seen Leah and Nick after she left her friend's house. Leah was only 15 at the time, which could have provided a motive for Nick to commit the crime and could have landed him in jail. Leah Freeman's body was discovered on August 23, 2010, 10 years after she passed away. Her boyfriend Nick McGuffin was taken into custody and accused of being the cause of death. The prosecution used the testimony of 2 witnesses during the trial. Leah and Nick were allegedly seen by a witness at 9 o'clock. The day she vanished, close to the establishment where the first pair of sneakers was discovered. Nick allegedly tried to drag Gila into a car as they were shouting. According to the prosecution, it was at this time when Nick allegedly hurt Leah, as evidenced by the stains on the shoes. Someone who claimed to have had an argument with Nick in 2002, and that Nick had threatened to treat him the same way he treated Leah, was the second and most significant witness. This accusation was understood as this witness was the ex-boyfriend of the young lady Nick subsequently married, which would have influenced his testimony, but the prosecutor ruled out the likelihood of prejudice. Nick McGuffin refused to confess guilt, but in the absence of any tangible proof, he only had the testimony of witnesses. Nick McGuffin was found guilty of Leah Freeman's involuntary manslaughter by 10 of the jury's 12 members. When the verdict was revealed on July 19, 2011, 11 years after she passed away, he received an 11-year prison term. The mother experienced her first moment of comfort upon learning that the person who had kidnapped her daughter was now in jail, but the narrative doesn't end there. In 2014, Nick McGuffin's relentless insistence on his innocence and his prolific letter writing to multiple human rights organizations produced results. One of these organizations became interested in his case, and Jazz Parakow, his new attorney, started looking into the facts and witness accounts that had led to the guilty conviction. As she learned, in addition to the police concealed vital information that would have impacted the jury's verdict due to the lack of tangible proof connecting Nick McGuffin to the killing of Leah Freeman. The fact that Leah's clothing contained traces of gray automotive paint that did not coincide with the hue of Nick's car during the trial was kept a secret. Although it was stated that the Mustang's interior had been completely cleaned when it was originally checked, pictures from that time clearly showed otherwise. Witness statements disputed the prosecution's witnesses' assertions that I witnessed Leah and Nick fighting outside the school at around 9 o'clock. But these unreported testimonies claim they weren't brought up in court. Leah was seen by witness Nick Backman at 9 o'clock. Leah was out on her own that evening while he was at an ATM. Additionally, the authorities seized the ATM videotape, which showed that his meeting occurred at precisely 9:04 p.m. In the 10 years between the discovery of the corpse and the footwear and Nick McGuffin's arrest, during which time technology advanced, one of the most serious instances of police professionalism occurred, had significantly progressed, especially in the area of DNA testing. As is well known, one of the sneakers identified as containing Leah Freeman's biological material in 2000 had significant crimson stains. The police mysteriously chose not to send the footwear for more examination after 10 years, and the chance to learn more using new technologies. This decision ultimately had a big impact on Nick McGuffin's life. The attorney got in touch with the lab that had tested the shoes in order to request a copy of the original DNA analysis result in 2000 and was shocked to learn that, in addition to Leah's DNA, his DNA had also been discovered on the footwear. However, the male DNA was so minute that at the time, technology could not further identify it, and its discovery was no longer mentioned anywhere in the police records. Nevertheless, the police decided not to conduct a further investigation in 2010, despite having all the available options. The footwear were submitted for re-examination in 2017, thanks to Nick's defense, and the results showed that both male and female DNA was present. However, the detected samples were so small that it was impossible to obtain comprehensive information for comparison with the FBI database. They could only reveal similarities when compared directly to the DNA of the person who left them. The sneakers, both inside and outside, did not belong to Nick McGuffin. Nick McGuffin's guilty judgment was reversed on November 29, 2019, and his case was given back to the prosecutor who had been in charge of it during the 2011 trial. The prosecutor claimed that simply because McGuffin was found guilty was overturned doesn't mean he's innocent, given that Nick had already completed nearly all of his 11-year sentence and the new evidence. The prosecutor chose not to pursue a new trial against him. On December 17, 2019, Nick McGuffin was released from prison. He now intends to hold the authorities accountable for erasing 10 years from his life. The investigation into Leah Freeman's killing is still ongoing, but possibly new techniques will one day be developed that will allow for a more precise identification of the murderer. Mom Corey Cartwright is still of the opinion that the individual is Nick McGuffin. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching.